If you think your child's struggling with something, check it out, because the sooner you get onto it, the younger that they are, the more open they are to experiencing it as part of who they are without all the social stigma and things getting to them as an older person, and just the impact it has on your self-esteem. You know, years and years of feeling bad about yourself is not great for anybody. And if you can prevent that for your children by finding out what that struggle is and helping them with strategies, that's the biggest gift you can give them.
Thomas Edison, Richard Branson, John F. Kennedy, Mozart, Michael Jordan, Will Smith. That sounds like a list of highly successful titans in a variety of vocations. Why is it that we rarely hear that they have or had ADHD? And you know what we hear even less about? Serena Williams, Emma Watson, Mel Robbins, Whoopi Goldberg, Agatha Christie, Erin Brockovich, Cher. Yeah, the successful women navigating ADHD. And that's exactly why I started this podcast, ADHD for Smartass Women. I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, a lifelong student, now a coach. I'm also the creator of Your ADHD Brain is A-OK, a system that helps people like you figure out what they should do with their life. And we're here today to talk ADHD, your strengths, your symptoms, your workarounds, and how you proudly stand out instead of trying to fit in. I credit my ADHD for some of my greatest gifts. And you know what? I spy a happier life for you too. So without further ado, a shiny new episode is starting now. Hello, I am your host, Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for episode 190 of ADHD for Smartass Women. I hope that you'll subscribe to this podcast and our newsletter over at tracyotsuka.com. My purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. Look, in the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, I've never met not one, that isn't truly brilliant at something. So for all of these reasons, I am just delighted to introduce you to Lara Connolly. Lara, is it Lara or Laura?
It's Lara, but yeah, so not Laura,
Perfect.
Lara, yeah.
Okay. So let me keep going then. Lara Connolly is a teacher's assistant working with a range of neurodiverse students, including students with autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, and dyslexia at a primary school. The kids are ages 5 to 12 in Wellington, New Zealand. In her previous life, Lara was a lawyer specializing in family law with a particular interest in supporting families who experienced family violence and or mental health challenges. Lara attended the University of Canterbury, where she studied law and sociology. She had her first child at 23 and finished her degrees part-time while sole parenting, finally graduating when her daughter was 3 years old. Lara lives with her husband, youngest daughter, their cat Scooby, and their Bernese mountain dog Frida. Her current hyperfocus is researching her family history and learning Irish and Te Reo Maori. Okay, how do you pronounce that?
Te Reo Maori.
Te Reo Maori.
Fantastic.
Okay, Te Reo Maori, the language of the indigenous Maori people of New Zealand. In her free time, she loves going to live music, gardening, knitting, vintage patterns, and walking her dog on the beach. Lara, did I get all that right?
You sure did. Great job on the pronunciation of Te Reo Maori.
Okay, Te Reo Maori. So what is Te Reo Maori?
It's the Maori language. So it's the language of the Maori people who are our indigenous people here in New Zealand. They were here first and we're colonizers, I guess. And so definitely. And so it's part of curriculum at school. It's really important that we learn it. And we have a treaty here in New Zealand to be working with Māori people. And over the last 40 years, there's been more of a resurgence of the language here in New Zealand, and more people are learning it.
So are you fluent?
No, in no regard, no. But basics to be able to count and greet people. Part of Te Reo Māori, an important part of it is being able to introduce yourself in Te Reo Māori, and the Māori people, are linked to the land, and so they will introduce you telling you their river and their tribe and their mountain. But for us, as colonisers, our ancestral lands are somewhere else. So that kind of links into the ancestral stuff that I've been doing, finding where my ancestral lands are so I can do a proper introduction in Te Reo Māori.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. So, Lara, I always want to start with the ADHD diagnosis story. So can we do that? What were the circumstances? What happened?
Well, my son was diagnosed with OCD when he was 10. My youngest daughter got very, very sick with bacterial pneumonia and ended up in ICU. She was only 8 at the time. And that event, that trauma, triggered my son's OCD. And I knew I was a Pollyanna from that moment, because I thought once we got his diagnosis, well, my daughter's illness, which was terrible, and we were in hospital for 11 days, triggered that OCD at an age where we could really help him with CBT and all those kinds of things. So we were in the system, as it were, with a psychologist from that time. But then when he got into his teenage years, he was very, very clever, very outgoing, sporty kind of kid. He started struggling in the year where assessment became important. Here in New Zealand, we assess children at high school from 15 through to 18. They have 3 years of assessment that go towards their final qualification. And so it's quite full on in terms of the academic work they need to do. And he'd been able to wing it until then. But then things started to get harder, as we know now, with ADHD brains, and he became depressed. And it was a real shock to us, and he just became numb, and we thought, what's going on? We'd seen him starting to struggle and had been working with his psychologist throughout that time, saying, look, we think something else is going on for him. And when he became depressed, we linked in with a psychiatrist, and she said, I think that this is ADHD. And she started talking about the symptoms and how it worked and the genetics of it. And as she was talking through that, my husband looked at me and I looked at him, and everything kind of clicked into place. And I said, look, I think I need to be assessed as well. And it was no surprise to me when it came up that I was definitely ADHD combined type.
So can I ask you, so your son was about 15 at this time?
Yes, yeah.
So what was going on was the academics, it was just getting harder and harder, and it exceeded his ability to cope.
Yes. Well, I mean, he was still academically capable to do it. It was the organisation, the getting it down. Yeah, so combining it with the OCD, he's got a good handful of perfectionism in there, just like me as well. That whole, it had to be right. So he had this combination where the ADHD would mean that he would find it really difficult to get started. And then as he was doing the work, it would be really difficult with the OCD and his perfectionism in terms of getting it right to stop. So I would be the one to motivate him to start something. And my husband, who's an ex-journalist, would be the one to say, okay, stop, that's good now. You can stop now. But that was just becoming far too hard. And yeah, it led to a episode of depression, which we had fabulous support. We just linked in with the psychiatrist because we'd seen that he was really starting to struggle in terms of his mood, and we just linked that all in. So we were able to get really good, clear support for him through that period. We didn't have to wait. We've got a public health system here, but we had gone private. If we'd had to wait for the public system, I'm sure his depression would have deepened. So we were very fortunate to access those resources quickly, and that resolved. And the ADHD medication that he takes just clicked for him immediately. And in a way, once again, the Pollyanna in me, I don't ever want anyone to feel the way that he did during that period. But because he had that experience, he's very compliant with his medication, more compliant than I think your average teenager would be, because he doesn't want to feel like that again.
Mm. Well, and it works, right? I think when kids aren't compliant, it's because it's not working and it's making them feel worse.
That's right. I mean, he does have some side effects in terms of he had nausea for a while, but that's settled down and it does impact on how he eats. But he sees in the main, the benefit of it is huge.
So was he diagnosed with inattentive ADHD or combined type?
No,
as well?
combined type. He's a musician. He's a very outgoing, social, physically active kind of guy, as well as loves, can go too much in his head. Yeah. So yeah, combined type.
So I'm curious with the OCD and ADHD and how that affected school. So was the problem purely starting, or were there other things? Is he pretty darn organized and on top of things and never late?
No. Yeah, he's completely ADHD in terms of the organizational stuff. Yeah, the executive function stuff was there. And that's where there was this terrible bind for him. He really had this perfectionist side once he got going on a project and did fabulous work. He did really well at school once he got started, but then he would hyperfocus and deep dive into the project, and then it would be really hard for him to be happy with it in the end. That was the OCD side of it. It was never good enough, when of course it was over good enough. It was great, but he would find that really hard. So he'd find it hard to start with getting all the organizational skills together, and then hard to sign off at the end.
Yeah. Although that's pretty ADHD too, right? Once we get sucked into that rabbit hole. So I'm curious, when you were sitting there with a psychologist or psychiatrist, I can't remember what you said, and they were talking about ADHD and the symptoms, what were they saying that made you think, oh my gosh, this is me?
It was really when she was describing how you don't have to have hyperactivity obviously on the outside, that what was going on for my son and primarily was a hyperactive brain, and talking about how you can be having so many different thoughts at the same time. And I just thought, oh my God, that's me. And another huge part of it for me is emotional regulation. Both of us really struggle with that, from the really positive, exuberant kind of, we're big huggers, where dinner time at our family is everybody talking over each other, lots of politics, lots of fun conversations. But also on the other side of it, if we get really upset, that can be quite distressing for both of us. So yeah, the emotional regulation really stood out for me, because both of us, one of the things, I was a big reader, always from a child right the way through. I love reading, and I would escape to those worlds, but I also would kind of absorb it, not be able to remember the exact words or the chapters or whatever, but I'd remember the essence of it. And I remember when struggling with Shay's behaviour as a younger child, right, trying to help him with that, I read The Explosive Child by Professor Green. And I remember thinking at the time, and when I was in the psychologist's office, it just clicked for me. I read the book and I thought, that's great, but what about the explosive parent? And I thought, because that's me. Where's the book about the explosive parent? And, for me now, that made so much sense, that here I was, this emotionally dysregulated parent in my worst moments, and I knew exactly what I should be doing, but I'd just not be able to cope. I'd get overwhelmed and lost in the moment.
Okay, so tell me what that would look like when you're talking about the explosive parent. Was it overreacting to little things, or these were big things and you just kind of overdid it a little bit?
Well, it was more the build-up of things. With OCD, you can, really pursue something. So say when Shay was a little boy, he'd really want to go to the dairy for lollies after school, right? And with your average child, you might be able to say, well, this day is our day that we do this. We'd have Friday is the day. But this young child would ask, as soon as I picked him up from school, and about 10 times, and I'd be trying really patiently to be my best positive parent and say things like, Friday is our day to go and get, that's the special treat day, this kind of stuff. And he would just pursue me, and in my head, and I'd just get overwhelmed, and I'd end up yelling at him, just saying, stop it now, I can't cope, this is not okay. And yeah, it was, and perfectionism in terms of parenting was something I was really hard on myself, and I'd be so like, oh, I shouldn't have yelled at my child, this is terrible, because I worked family law and saw a lot of cases of family violence,
Yeah.
I had an overextended kind of view of, and was really sensitive to doing that kind of thing. I didn't want any of that in our life, because I saw the impact it had on other families at the other extreme. But because that impacted on my view of the world, I was really hard on myself whenever I had one of those moments.
Yeah. I can understand why, and probably even if you weren't, involved in that, you still, we beat ourselves up because, there are times when we just lose it, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is a small child. I am the adult.
Yes. Yeah. And I'd think all of that rationally, but it would just, my emotional regulation would just, I couldn't do it. And so I was really, really hard on myself. And by the time Shay was diagnosed, I'd actually left the law already, because my daughter had struggled with dyspraxia. She needed speech therapy help when she was preschool, because my son could understand her and I could understand her when I really listened, but her language wasn't that obvious. And now I know that's a classic part of dyspraxia. So we had her in speech therapy, and I knew she was struggling, and Shay had already shown a lot of anxiety. So having worked with kids in family law and had a lot of psychologists that I'd worked with families, I was looking at my kids and their neurodiversity and their needs, and I was already reassessing, should I be doing this full-on job at the same time as supporting these kids? And I think that was also part of the ADHD. I was starting to feel overwhelmed, because not only was I working in this quite intense area of law, I was, doing all this extra stuff with the kids, the psychologist appointments, the occupational therapist eventually for my daughter with dyspraxia, which was brilliant, the speech therapist. And so trying to juggle all of that and parenting and my work just became too much. And I got physically unwell. I developed a inflammatory illness, and there were points where I would just work all week, get the kids through the school week, and then collapse on the couch in the weekends and not know why. And my body would it was like a chronic fatigue kind of situation. And my husband would just have to take up the slack. And now I know that it was because of my ADHD. I was working so much harder to keep it all together, and that was really impacting on my body, and my body was telling me to slow down.
So can I ask you, Lara, I have often wondered how, and I'm a lawyer by background as well, and I went to law school because I wanted to be a criminal, lawyer, or I wanted to practice criminal law. And then as I got closer and closer, I didn't have any kids then, but I thought, I cannot do this, with, violence against children and women. And do you think that was part of it? That just seems like such a hard area of law, and to not take it home and then have kids, right? Yeah. So you realize the magnitude even more once you have kids. I'm curious, do you think that might have been part of it, that it was the kind of law you practiced?
Absolutely. But I look back with my ADHD now, and because empathy is a huge part of who I am and part of my my ADHD picture, and I thrived on helping people. I was the first person in my family to go to university, and it wasn't really something that was held in high esteem so much in my family. Practical stuff was held in high esteem. And so for me, when I came across feminism, I really wanted to do something practical as well, not just the theory. I needed to prove that, look, this is not just theory in the ivory towers. This is stuff that supports people. And so I volunteered in a women's refuge while I was studying. And that experience really led me to family law. Was the only one that I felt that I was truly attracted to, because I wanted to help families and the kids. And I was able to be professional. I'm pretty sure of that. But I didn't have that professional wall, because I was able to convince myself the best way for me to deal with these feelings of empathy for these families and what they're going through is to be professional and do this job for them. But the effort that it took to build that professional wall was so draining because of how empathic I was. Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh, it makes total sense. I honestly, and I can already tell just by the way you speak that you have more empathy even than I do. And I couldn't handle it. And I knew that. And I think because I am less empathetic than you, I knew to build that wall before I even got there, because I knew I couldn't handle it. Versus you, who has so much empathy, was like, forget me. I've got to go in there and make that difference. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it was a selfish thing though for me as well, because I got so much.
Yeah.
You know how you've talked about when I've listened to you for 2 years, Tracy, and it's been so fabulous. So many things I can relate to. And one of them was when you were talking about different jobs that people with ADHD have, and talking about the emergency department doctor. The law that I did was the closest you can get to that, because we would be, our law firm was one of the firms that worked for the refuges, and they would be referred to us, and we would help families get safe quickly with protection orders and things like that, and get kids safe as well. And then eventually, as lawyer for child, I was working in cases along those lines, and it was that hit that I would get from, yes, I helped someone today, or having to get those papers into court so that we could get this family safe. I see that now from listening to your podcast, that was the only law that I could possibly do.
It's the dopamine, baby.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so before we go into what it is that you're doing now, because I understand you have left the law to do something that it sounds like it gives you the same amount of dopamine rush. Is that true?
It does, in a different way. Well, what happened really in working in the law is that once I left, I looked back at those 14 years and realized, apart from the time that I took off to have my children, and I took off a year each time I had my children, I was working on adrenaline the whole time, just pumped full of it. And that was what made my body give up in the end.
Right.
And so I had to step back from that for my own health. And so now the work that I do, it does give me that hit of helping people, but in a much healthier way.
Wow. Okay, so before we go into that, what I'd love to know is, what was Lara like as a child?
Sure. Well, I was really exuberant, and I was a singing, dancing, acting machine in terms of putting on plays and herding my two younger brothers to be actors in them.
Me too.
And school reports were classic. I can remember, and this was even before my diagnosis, like when we were looking at school report stuff for my diagnosis, I just laughed. You know, it was enthusiastic contributor. and just saying nicely that I talk too much, and they would say things like, Lara is an enthusiastic contributor, needs to give other members of the class an opportunity to make contributions as well. Things like that.
Why?
Yeah, why? I don't know why. But I also needed that time. I was a bit of a lone wolf. You know, I always felt different. I loved people, and I loved connecting with people and making friends. And even now, I'm still the kind of person who, if you're in the lift, I'll strike up a conversation with people, that kind of thing. But I also spent a lot of time in my room reading, and I hyper-focused on projects. And the funniest one was when I was 10, that was peak Princess Diana time. And I did this huge project. I had the haircut and the clothes, and did this project on Princess Diana, where my father was so tolerant, they bought me an old typewriter, And I sat in my room and typed all these captions, and he'd even let me use the photocopier at his work and screeds of photos out of books and magazines. And I made this huge project, and I must have spent months on it. And so I just look back at that kind of hyper focus as well. So I was really social, but I also had a lot of alone time. So what else about my childhood? Yes, I was too much, really, I think, for my family. And looking at, during lockdown, my daughter and I did this project where we asked my parents, who were isolating by themselves, questions about their childhood and things like that. And from those questions, I really drew a picture that and understood that both of my parents were really quite quiet children. They were really a lot quieter than me. So it really helped me understand how I was too much. You know, that was the sense that I got, you know, that I was quite a lot to handle.
Were you an only child?
No, I had two brothers. So I was the only girl, and I was the firstborn grandchild on my mum's side. So I was a bit of a princess.
So you were the oldest?
Yes.
Okay. You know, you mentioned Princess Diana, and I saw during COVID, I saw one of the documentaries, probably several of the documentaries on her. Yeah. And I just really believe that poor woman was in a ton of ADHD. I mean, complete with, you know, she's a total empath. She loved people.
Yeah.
Movement was so important to her. You know, she struggled with this eating disorder. I wonder if there's any research that's been done on that, but it just made me think of that.
Yeah, well, that'd be interesting. But yeah, I was, and I guess it was the empathic side of her that I was really attracted to, as well as the glamour, being 10.
Yeah. Until you really learned, oh my gosh, what that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a complete Republican now, but not your kind of Republican, as in we should be a republic.
Oh no. Okay. Yeah. So what about school? Was school pretty easy as far as grades?
Well, it was, I did well, but it was because I thought I was not as smart as my friends because I had to do more work than them. I guess it gets summed up by a couple of things. In our last year of high school, I got the Diligence Award.
Oh.
You know, classic. And because I did work really hard to do it, but I loved learning, and I just was so frustrated that I wasn't as clever as my friends because I couldn't remember everything as well as they did. But I really loved learning, and so that just motivated me a lot. And then the other thing was, at high school, I had two nicknames, and they were Mum and Dizzy, and I think that sums up how the ADHD affected me. So I saw myself as quite an anxious person for a lot of my life, but as soon as I started taking ADHD medication, that anxiety disappeared. But at that stage of my life, I was the cautious one. I had a long-term boyfriend at high school, so I was a bit more grown up than some of my other friends. So they saw me as the mum of the group. I'd always bring up the things that we had to be careful about. But also they also called me Dizzy because they'd say it was ironic because I was really clever but no good at any of the practical parts of life. So that kind of sums up high school. But then I thrived with music and acting. You know, I did lots of drama and music at high school. That I think singing is in terms of my emotional regulation, that really helped me through those years of doing a lot of singing.
So Lara, you sound like the quintessential ADHD young person.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I was a risk taker, but in a very cautious way, if that makes sense. I'd leap off in certain areas where I felt safe, you know, but I was anxious about where that would go, but then I'd impulsively do things that young people do, you know.
So can I ask you, were you treated for anxiety before you were diagnosed with ADHD, like when you were younger, or no?
Not as an adult. I went to therapy for my anxiety, and it's interesting. And that's one of the things that I'd really recommend with people is if they suspect ADHD to find a therapist who specialises in ADHD if that's what you suspect. But at the time I didn't. And my therapist, who's wonderful and worked through a lot of issues with her, and I went back to her once I had this diagnosis. I now see a different therapist who does specialise in ADHD. She said she wouldn't have thought of it for me because of, it's that whole thing of it not really being thought of as something for women or for adults for such a long time.
I hope she's thinking of it now for her, new patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, she was really interested and open to that. But now I have a therapist who's fabulous, who specialises in that, and an EMDR, which has really been a breakthrough for me in terms of the emotional regulation and the RSD.
Okay, hold on there. I want to talk about EMDR, but I want to wrap up with, I just want to make sure that I understand you. So the minute you were diagnosed with ADHD and you started on ADHD medication, the anxiety was gone? Is that what you said?
Yes, wow. Yeah. The best example of that was, I wasn't sure, when I was trialing it, I had a little bit of, is this working or isn't this? But the really amazing thing that happened to me that was a light bulb moment was we went on a family holiday to Fiji, which sounds glamorous, but it's pretty close to New Zealand and lots of families go. And
so it's our Hawaii.
Yeah. And so we were there, and my husband's a real risk taker kind of guy. He's a snowboarder who at the age of 50 still does tricks and mountain biking and all that kind of stuff. And so he wanted us as a family to swim with the giant manta ray. And in the place where we were staying, there's this amazing channel where they gather. And they basically, it's got a huge current, and a boat drops you at one end, and you swim in the current with the manta ray and come out at the other end. Now, before being on medication, I would not have got into that water because it would have overwhelmed me in terms of just the sensations of the deepness, the current, the temperature. But when he suggested it, there was no way I was going to let him take the children out there without me. I had to be there for that. And what was amazing was both my son and I had started our ADHD medication, and his anxiety had leveled out as well. And we were actually leading the pack. We were the first people to dive into the water. And here I was in this current, in this beautiful ocean with this huge, majestic black butterfly creature in front of us. And I just had this moment where I just realized this medication's working because I'm really enjoying this. And here I am with my son doing something I never would have done otherwise.
I have goosebumps. I can see it. I can literally visualize the picture of you and your son out there. Okay, so it's so interesting that you bring up EMDR. And again, not to get back to the royal family, but the first time I saw someone going through EMDR was Prince Harry on that, whatever the special was that he did with Oprah about mental health.
I thought I saw that, but I missed the bit about EMDR.
Yeah, well, they actually filmed him going through EMDR because I guess what had happened, I can't really remember, but my recollection is that, he was still grieving and had trauma over the death of his mother, right? He was so young. And so they were working through that. And so I'm curious. So tell us what an EMDR is, and then I'd like to know what your experience with it was. It sounds like it really worked for you.
Well, I'm not an expert in EMDR, but it's eye movement. I can't even remember what it stands for, but it was the rapid eye movement.
It's eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. And I first was introduced to it by my psychiatrist, who suggested it for me once I was diagnosed with PTSD on top of my ADHD, because when I started my ADHD medication, like you've mentioned on many an episode, that manages the ADHD. And then the other things that your comorbidities can kind of come to the fore. And I became extremely irritated by things. And my son was 17, so he was being a 17-year-old, and I was not coping with normal 17-year-old behaviours. And I said to the psychiatrist, look, I'm not sure about this medication. This is what's going on. And so what I could see was happening was that he was doing his normal 17-year-old moving away from me as a 17-year-old stuff, and I was still hanging on there. And you know, the rejection sensitivity disorder was really magnifying that, you know, making me feel even more rejected, you know, than the normal mums being rejected by their teenagers because they're growing up, you know. And so that was all too much. And she recognized that there was PTSD there and recommended a book to me by Francine Shapiro, and it was Getting Past Your Past. And she suggested EMDR, and I read the book, and it just really resonated with me. And I said, yes, I think that's something that I could do. And I found this therapist. I had to wait 6 months to get to see her, and we started the work. And it's really been the final layer of assistance with my RSD to process those trigger points, those memories, that all those kind of times where I felt rejected, to process them and help let go of that pain, and so that I'm not so triggered by the next smaller thing that happens now. So it's helped with my emotional regulation so much. Does that explain it?
So when you say PTSD, are you talking about PTSD around your ADHD?
Yes, and my psychiatrist explained it, that it was related to that empathy that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Because I had a lot of experiences in my workplace. I've had, like a lot of practitioners in that area, you know, I've had clients that have passed away as a result of being killed by their perpetrators. Terrible things happen to children that I've been working with that's outside of my control. I've had death threats, you know, all those kinds of things that impact, and a part of that world of practicing in that area. And I used to beat myself up a lot about, well, why can't I cope with this like these other practitioners who seem to be able to just move past it? It really got inside me. And on top of that, there was the impact of that build-up of the little traumas of the rejection that happened all along the way that I felt in an amplified way. Yeah.
Well, and I think people don't realize, right, that, you know, you think, oh, it's ADHD, that's not trauma, because we're thinking of big T trauma, like, you know, violence. Yeah.
And I really struggled with the diagnosis. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I really struggled with the diagnosis of PTSD because I saw people with real capital T trauma.
You worked with them.
I worked with them all the time. And I thought, I don't have PTSD. These people have experienced true trauma. And so for me, it took a long time to accept that the little build-up of those little moments, that because I felt them so deeply, whether that was what was intended or not, had really caused me to feel so hurt.
Absolutely. And so what's traumatic to one person who is not an empath, right?
Yeah.
That's completely different than what's traumatic to someone who is an empath, who feels things so deeply. Yeah.
And there was a moment when I knew that I had to give up the law, was when I was working with a particularly traumatized dad who had come from a Eastern European background and had experienced all the trauma of living in a country under the Cold War kind of environment. And he didn't trust authority, and there was a lot of trauma there for him. And it was a really difficult case in building a relationship with him, all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I was starting to physically become unwell, and I could actually physically feel that barrier of my professional barrier coming down, and his trauma kind of really seeping into me. And I thought, right, okay, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep up that professional wall anymore. I've got to let go of this. I can't do it. I can't look after my family and do this.
Yeah. So EMDR. What do you feel it did? Well, first, kind of describe what happens when you're going through EMDR.
Well, you identify some memories that you have that are particularly stick out, and you talk through those memories with your therapist about which ones you want to work on processing. You can have some particular moments that really you can identify yourself as it really hurt you still, or that you need to process. And I'd done a lot of talk therapy, and I felt like I was talked out, which seems impossible for somebody like me who keeps talking whatever the situation. But it didn't really complete the process for me. And so you identify those moments, and then the therapist guides you through thinking about that, and you watch either on screen, like there's a program where you watch a dot, if you were doing it by Zoom, like as we were through the lockdowns here, or just watch the finger of the therapist as it moves back and forth while you're thinking about those memories. And there's this whole process where that helps your brain file away and process that memory in a different way so that it's not traumatizing anymore.
So you're actually using your eyes to move from side to side while you are talking about this trauma.
Yeah.
And then you're also tapping, right? Or did she have you do that on your shoulders?
Well, she was moving her finger, and you don't talk so much as you decide on the memory, and then you think about it. And then after a little while, she'll pause and say, so what did that bring up? And you might say what you were thinking about as that process was going on. And she goes, okay, she'll pick out a bit of what you were thinking about and go, think about that point particularly now and process that. So then you do the eye movement again, and then she'll pause and say, all right, what was coming up now? So it's like you're gradually processing that thought in a way that it kind of unsticks the memory. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does to me because, I'm somewhat familiar with this. So it takes the charge out of it, right? So you can then think about the memory and it doesn't upset you. It removes that, those emotional ups and downs.
That's right. And so the reason I knew it was working was things that would trigger an emotional response for me, that trigger was gone. And I could step back from it in a way and step away from a situation in a way that I previously would have reacted.
So your teenager would be a teenager and you'd be like, he's just being a teenager.
That's right. Yeah.
And how long did that take?
Well, it's still a work in progress. Like all of this is still a work in progress. I feel like I've really processed the biggest hurdles, but there's always stuff to work on. So, but it's been it took probably 6 months of doing it on a monthly basis to really process most of the big memories for me. Yeah. And it's just made such a huge difference to being able to live the life that I want to live, to model the person who I want to be, which I always knew was how I wanted to live, but just this reactive part of me, I felt let me down. But now I know, and I still react sometimes, but just no way at the same level.
That is just so interesting how 6 sessions, literally that's what it was, can make such a change in how your emotional regulation, how you're able to regulate, your nervous system.
Yeah. Well, she did say that I was like a sponge, that EMDR was perfect for me. Like I did process things quite quickly once I got into the rhythm of it. Yeah. And I love that there's science behind it. So many things, because I've done over the years trying to manage my emotions and figure out what was wrong with me, all those kinds of things. I've tried lots of different things. And this is just, to have the science behind this is great. There's the psychiatrists and the psychologists back it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that, obviously talk therapy serves its purpose, but over time, I've spoken to so many people who literally for decades have gone to a therapist and all they've done is talk. And at what point are you just digging those grooves in deeper and deeper and you just start to believe that this is who you are, versus something that's more somatic. It's forcing you to bring your body into the equation.
And it just makes so much sense to me because it was my body that was
dysregulating
messages. Yeah. So it really does resonate, and I really encourage people to give it a go, particularly if RSD and emotional regulation is a big part of your symptoms. Yeah. I can remember when doing the talk therapy with my son as well, when we were, I can remember saying to his therapist, who was working with him for OCD, I said, when my son wasn't there, obviously, look, I feel like there's something broken in me. I'm not, because we were doing a lot of exposure therapy for him to help him with his OCD fears. Yeah. And that can be really tough because they don't want to be exposed to the thing that they're, and so, it takes a lot of patience and things like that. But there would be points, as I said before, where I'd get overwhelmed and I'd say, look, there's something going on with me. And I was right, but she would say to me, it's just hard. It's hard parenting someone. You're doing all right. This is just tough, But I'm glad we were able to get the diagnoses that we did.
Has your son ever tried EMDR?
Not yet, but he's got a great therapist now. His previous therapist was great for his childhood, but now he's seeing one appropriate for his age and really working with him and enjoying that process. So that's one of the great things and that I think about, which is so important, is early diagnosis, and that's one of the things.
Yes.
That I think about the way I saw myself for 47 years, as too much, and like as a lawyer, I would have to do cross-examination, and I'd have friends who were at the same level as me, been practicing for 10 years, who could just have a couple of bullet points and wing it with their cross-examination in court. For me, I'd have to prepare the script, that I'd have. I would be able to wing points once I was in there, but I had to have the script done, and I'd do double the preparation of them. I've forgotten where I was going now. See, I went off on a tangent. But it was, what was I saying?
I had asked about your son and if he had tried EMDR, and you said that he's working with a really good therapist right now.
All right. Yeah. I've forgotten what I was talking about, but
par for the course.
Classic.
You're on the right podcast.
Yeah. But it was just that, I can't remember.
I wonder, though, in what you're saying about having to over-prepare all the time, and your colleagues who've done it, for a shorter period of time, just being able to go in and wing it. Do you think part of that, though, is just the anxiety around knowing that, your brain doesn't have the best working memory? And because I can relate to what you're saying. So what ends up happening is I over-prepare. But then sometimes I can go in and I'm not prepared at all. And I am totally just winging it. And I am so on. But it's like I can access that part of my brain in that moment. But you give me even a little bit of anxiety, or whatever. The situation gives me even a little bit of anxiety. The only way that I can quell that, prefrontal cortex, the only way I can access the prefrontal cortex is for me to not be anxious. And so I over-prepare to combat the anxiety.
Absolutely. And that's what I was doing, because here I had these people's lives in my hands. And I was thinking, I've got to do my best job for these people, and the only way that I could quell that anxiety that would result from that was making sure that I'd prepared, as much as I possibly could, because I did have that sensation, that moment where I knew the law. I knew what I was doing. I'd done this for 14 years, but then it was in my brain. It was this, I couldn't access things as quickly as other people could. I had to see it, remind myself with bullet points, or go back over the case law to remind myself of that. I couldn't just pull it out of the hat. It's like with music. I love music, and I love so many different kinds of music, and the true musos know the tracks, the names of the albums, and all that kind of stuff. Me, no, I just know I like a song, and I can't. Apart from my main favorite people, I can't name that album that year. I just
oh my gosh, Lara, I cannot even memorize one sentence from a chorus. If it was before I turned 12, I don't know. I can't remember. Sometimes I remember it, sometimes I don't. But yet when I hear something from when I was younger. It just triggers all these memories, and I just love it so much. But then I can't remember what the hell was it.
Yeah, and the ADHD explains how much I love live music as well, because I love going to live music and just that sensory seeking, feeling the music. You know, I just really, it's one of my things that I've maintained throughout my life. Yeah, it was just such a physical experience for me, you know, so I love it. And it makes sense to me now why. Yeah.
Okay, so you left law and you are now working with neurodivergent kids. How did that come about?
When I first left the law, I wasn't working for a while. I was just managing the kids' appointments and getting well. I just had to physically do things like yoga, although even with yoga, I couldn't do yoga without listening to my music, because otherwise my brain would just be all over the place. So I had to do yoga with music going to still my brain. Went to acupuncture a lot just to heal. But while I was doing that, I would volunteer at my daughter's school. I'd go on all the school trips. If they needed extra parent help, I would be there. And so as my daughter got older and went to high school, it was actually in the year that she left the school. And I thought, and I had a connection with that primary school from the time that my oldest daughter, who's now 27, started school there. And so I'd had a child at that school for maybe 18 years, you know, depending on which child it was. So I had a strong connection with the teachers and the community. And there were a couple of autistic children there. They were twins, and they needed a teacher aide and one of my friends was a teacher there, and she asked me if I would do it. And I hadn't been working in paid work for probably 4 years by that stage. And as much as focusing on the kids and my health was an important thing, there was a real negative side to it, is that it gave me plenty of time to ruminate and think about, you know, I really did think I was a failure for burning out and not being able to keep doing the job that I had loved. I knew this was the best thing for me to step back from it, but I was being pretty hard on myself for not being able to do everything. And I came across a quote from one of your country's wonderful people, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she said, you know, I had it all, just not all at the same time. And that's what I feel like is the way my life needed to work. I needed to simplify things. And so when this job came up, I just thought, yes, I'd been working, my daughter had been having occupational therapy for her dyspraxia for 5 years, fortnightly, and the occupational therapist would come to our home. And so that's a lot of occupational therapy. And I learned a lot about dyspraxia and things to help that. I also had absorbed so much about OCD and was soon to add ADHD knowledge to my bow as well. And so I took the job. I thought, okay, I'm in this world of neurodiverse kids. I'd love to be a teacher aide there and support those kids. And I learned so much, because autism is such a spectrum and every child is different. And so I learn more from them than I'm sure they get from me. It's wonderful getting to know each child and what their needs are and what their strengths are, and helping support them at school's been one of my biggest joys, really.
Why?
I love helping them access what's in their head and being able to put it out there. This one boy that I worked with was non-verbal, the first boy I worked with, but he loved the iPad. And we made these amazing, on Book Creator, by the end of the year, he was making these amazing cartoon books, telling stories, sharing them with his peers. And I just loved helping him connect with his peers and building that connection with him, helping him feel comfortable to come out of his world. Does that make sense? It's a real joy and a real privilege. Yeah.
Yeah, showing him who he really is and what his gifts are.
Yeah, but also helping him feel comfortable to connect with others, because it's such a hard thing to do when you're autistic, you know, and he wanted to connect with others. It was just it was just helping facilitate that, really, you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
So is it you're helping him understand himself and how he can learn how to do the things he wants to do?
Yeah. Like supporting him to use some strategies and helping him see which works for him, you know, which ones work for him. Yeah. And so using that iPad and creating those stories, which he loved doing, he loved just making them. That was fun. But then he saw he was able to share his pride and what he made with his peers, and they would connect with that, and he connected with them in a way that he hadn't before. And so, you know, opening possibilities for him, that was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the ADHD brain at work, right? It's the creativity, it's the problem solver.
And then I've worked with children who've experienced trauma as well. That felt like full circle. A child who had experienced trauma through family violence and had very ADHD-like symptoms, but they weren't able to really be in the classroom without being hypervigilant and reactive and all that kind of stuff. And just seeing, building that relationship with that child and seeing her then relax and be able to build more relationships within the classroom and actually start to try and learn, because she was just too hypervigilant and too scared in her brain to learn. And just building that relationship and being that kind of touchstone for them helps them be able to learn and build relationships outside of you. It's great for the ADHD brain in that there's so much variety. Every child is different. And within the classroom, you have these lessons that they're doing. Okay, we're doing maths. What's this child's particular needs? How can I assist them with this moment? And then, all right, 40 minutes later, we're on to writing. And okay, so you've not only got the variety within the classroom, but the variety in the children. So it's perfect for my ADHD brain.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is the best advice that you could give to the parents of an ADHD child?
The more open they are to experiencing it as part of who they are without all the social stigma and things getting to them as an older person, and just the impact it has on your self-esteem. You know, years and years of feeling bad about yourself is not great for anybody. And if you can prevent that for your children by finding out if there is a struggle that they're going through, what that struggle is, and helping them with strategies, that's the biggest gift you can give them. And, I just think don't be afraid of labels, because every child I see who's been diagnosed, including my own children, I've seen a weight lift off their shoulders because they understand now, why can't I do what my peers are doing? Why do I find this hard? And if they can understand that it's part of the way their brain is wired, it's not a defect of their personality or whatever else they might be thinking, you're giving them the gift of self-esteem. And that's what we need. You know, I just worry about, we have a really high teenage suicide rate here in New Zealand. And, you know, it's being able to understand who you are and have compassion for yourself is just such a gift that you can give your children if they are diagnosed early. And it's a win-win. I always tell parents it's a win-win. Either you find out that your child has a challenge that needs some strategies and you can work with it, or you find out that they're developmentally rocking along where they should be. It's a win either way. You've got nothing to lose.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, you mentioned the sooner the better. And I have seen a lot of experts lately talking about, not a lot, I'll say a few experts talking lately about maybe it's better, you know, if you're considering medication. So many parents, I know I was one of them, and I was like, I don't want to give my son medication. You know, he's only 12.
Yeah.
You know, let's just see, can we wait this out? Well, the deal though is if medication really works, what they're saying now is give it as young as possible because of neuroplasticity. So their brains can change and they can learn the skills that they need to learn in order to be able to, go to school, do their homework, all of that. And then in a lot of instances, or I should say some instances, they no longer need the medication because they've learned what they need to do.
That's right.
So,
and for me, I regret, that's a big regret for me is, as I say, my son was extra compliant with his medication because he experienced that depression, but I wish he'd never had to go through that. I wish that we'd known earlier and that we'd been able to medicate him earlier. But I, like you, would have been hesitant, but I think I would have come to it earlier if we'd known sooner, and because it is, I kind of hesitate to use the word because it's such a strong word, but it is torturous. The ADHD brain can be a world of too much. It can be overwhelming. And if you want to be able to help your child see the world and function in the world and be happy, sometimes medication is the best thing.
Yeah, it can be life-changing if you're one of the lucky ones.
Yeah.
I wish I was. I still think there's got to be something out there. I just need to go back out on the hunt. So what are the ADHD traits that you feel are responsible for your success?
Well, I think the empathy is just how I love connecting with people. And I really, because of that, and I can really empathize with people and kind of go into a room and understand people and connect others to each other. I think that's a really big part of it. Also, my hyperfocus has been a great strength. I think that we can do so much because we're so passionate about what we're interested in. And, we deep dive into things in a way that neurotypical people would find really challenging, I think. And I think that's been a huge part of my success in terms of everything that I hyper-focused on the kids. And that led me to where I am today in lots of ways. Yes. So, I think that those two, and that also leads to that diligence and the perfectionism when it's under control, before it goes too far, because you really want to do your best when you're passionate about something or care about people. So, I think those are the traits that really have helped me be successful in my life. And also part of that empathy is being able to really understand myself. And once I had that diagnosis and could put the pieces of the puzzle together, really, really being able to listen to myself and know when it's enough, when I've taken on too much and having to step back. That's been important as well.
Do you have an ADHD workaround?
So many, Tracy. And a lot of them were strategies that I built up before I knew. And with the help of my husband, my biggest, the simplest one is planning the week's meals, and then shopping to that, because I used to hate cooking so much and I just couldn't do it. I'd come and look at the fridge and I'd be going, I can't even think where to start to cook this dinner. But when I've planned out the week and I come home and I know, okay, tonight I'm making this. And it just makes life so much easier and so much less overwhelming.
So how did you get, though, past I've never been able to do that. And the reason I can't do it is because I don't know what I want to eat until I'm hungry. I'm a nightmare. My husband would love it. And he's tried since we were married to plan the meals well in advance. I mean, now though, at least what we do is we shop once a week, maybe twice a week, big shopping. And then we pick from that and decide what we're going to do. But how did you get to the point? Unless maybe you just don't care about food, so it's really not a big deal, do you?
Yeah, well, no, I love food and I love eating really well. I want to, and so I picked food that I liked and the kids just had to lump it. But no, the kids were quite fussy eaters as well, so I had a limited palate to work with. So it was a bit of a challenge to come up with some really good things to eat that everyone would eat.
Do you have like 10 meals that you constantly
that's right.
Not regurgitate. What's it called? You keep bringing them back.
cycle through. Yeah.
Yes.
I have about 10 or more, and cycle through in a fortnightly cycle kind of thing. And it's so funny because my mother can ring and she'll know what I'm having for dinner because it's a Tuesday night.
The beauty of that, though, is that then you know exactly what to shop for when you're shopping, right? So it takes out all the thinking.
That's right. It does. And that's how I coped. And I mean,
how did you finally do it, though, Lara?
Well, I think what happened was it just became so overwhelming. Part of it was I stepped back from doing too much. I had to take out that really full-on career to be able to breathe. And so then I was able to do that. And I enjoy cooking now, because I've got the time to do it. I'm not exhausted at the end of the day having to throw some food together for everybody just for fuel. Now I have the time. I finish school at 3:00 and I've got the time to actually do what I need to do and cook those meals. So that was, I'm in a really privileged position where I could step back from the rat race, and my husband is in a position where he's our primary earner. So I could step back and make my life more simple so I could cope with things like that. Because I saw with our ADHD and my daughter's dyspraxia that nutrition and eating well was what we needed to do, was part of the picture. All these little bits that build the picture of coping better with life, eh?
So what you're basically doing is you're building a structure.
Yeah, I built a structure and I kept it simple. But I had to build in that helping people again, that for it to be meaningful, because otherwise I was sitting here, I felt like there was too much focus on me. I was ruminating about stuff, and it wasn't until I had work again and was doing something to help people as well that added to the meaningfulness of my life, that I was truly happy again. So having it as simple but meaningful was the goal.
Well, that makes so much sense, because when we have too much time, all we're doing is focusing on ourselves versus, especially for our type of brains, we are empathetic. We do want to help people. And so when we're doing that, we're, firing this dopamine so we feel better, and everything else seems to be easier then.
That's right. And there was far too much time on my own ruminating and feeling bad about what I hadn't been able to do. And I needed to get back out there doing again to really, be well. So that I feel really privileged that I got the opportunity to retrain and do this work, because I learn as much from the kids every day that as they get the support from me, I learn from them. So it's a great solution for me.
So Lara, where can people find you if they want to know more about you?
I've got an Instagram, I guess. I do post on, it's called the ADD Adventures of Lara and Frida. And
so wait. What's the Instagram handle?
So the Adventures, but spelled ADD, Ventures of Lara and Frida. And Frida is my dog's name. And I guess I don't really have a social media presence other than that. So if anyone wanted to get in contact with me through that would be fine. And that would be the place to get a hold of me.
Wonderful. Lara, thank you so much for spending time with us here today.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd just like to say thank you for what you do. A big part of being positive and moving forward with my diagnosis has been listening and being inspired by your podcast every week. It really has helped frame and identify the strengths that my ADHD brings, and to remind me every week of that. You do such great work for the women in the community here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. So thank you.
Thank you. So that's what I have for you for this week. If you like this episode with Lara, please let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brains work so that they too may discover their amazing strengths. And you know what? Your reviews help. As always, you're listening to ADHD for Smartass Women. Come join me over at tracyotsuka.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week. You've been listening to the ADHD for Smartass Women podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka, and we're available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Not coincidentally, ADHD for Smartass Women, it's also the name of our free Facebook group. We're a totally smartass community of successful, ambitious women who share our ADHD wins, questions, and workarounds. Join us at tracyotsuka.com, where you can also find more information on our Your ADHD Brain is A-OK system. I spy a happier life for us, and I'll see you again next week.